my son, he was 9 at the time, and this is when they came up with the narrative staying apart keeps us together, and it was splattered behind our fearless leader Daniel Andrews in every single one of his press conferences. Staying apart keeps us together. He saw that label, and though he'd never heard it from us at the time, he points at it and he's like, "Dad, that's a contradiction."
Isn't it amazing how kids can just be so incisive?
It was a very, very interesting moment where everyone has their own way of adjusting to what's happening around us, and we can all assume best intent at the beginning when we don't know what's going on. We don't know what the impacts of a particular virus or a pandemic or an illness or a massive situation will have on us, that we act in accordance to the perceived threat. And then at what point do we ask, does it cross over to, okay, we know what's going on right now, we know the impacts of what we're doing, we know the impacts of what we've done, we need to take a different approach here. That's the thing that many are starting to see now, 2 years later, that at first we were okay with it, but as time went by, it's been a bit tricky. One thing that I've said that has disappointed me the most has been the response of mental health professionals throughout this entire process. And I have to preface this with a statement that I thought mental health professionals would be very quick to say, hey, this isolation is not a really good idea. Cutting people off from their family members is not that good of an idea. Stopping people from going outside is not that good of an idea because it restricts their ability to take care of their own mental health. And then that didn't happen. And then it continuously did not happen when more and more restrictions for a longer period of time were being heaped. There wasn't any psychological, psychiatric counseling voice out there. And then you have 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 outliers like yourself, like what I tried to do back in 2020 to give a bit of light on what I saw was happening in terms of isolation, in terms of the controlling behaviors. I was able to see a bit of this from the context of my parents' experiences, which I've spoken about on this podcast before, coming from communist Romania and the control that was happening there, and their comments of this isn't a good idea. What's happening right now, we're giving the government is trying to take more and more control. And you can balance that in terms of, okay, are these people just having a flashback of post-traumatic stress and they're just being re-triggered by something that happened in their lifetime? But these are the voices that we've ignored, the people who have actually been through these sorts of things before. We've ignored them at the expense of taking on their own wisdom to say, okay, how can we, as you said before, how can we balance this experience with this expert, with this person who has an understanding of what's going on? What's been your sense of, or what's been your opinion on what's happened within the psychological field, within the counseling field, in light of what's happened in the past 2 years?
Yeah, it's been something that has puzzled me as well. I've had mixed experience, probably quite similar to you. Something that an idea I've been toying with recently, there's a book by Alain de Botton called Status Anxiety. And in that book, he talks about this idea that status is really our access to power, money, influence, maybe even love, is attached to this idea of status, being looked up to, being admired, It's about how other people perceive us, and we desire it. Status is currency. And there are different ways in which societies have a hierarchy of status, and access to that kind of hierarchy is through these different avenues. And I think during the pandemic, we have seen some very carefully constructed narratives about who are the good guys and who are the bad guys, who are the people who are the good members of our society, and who are the ones who can't be trusted and are putting others at risk. And there's a real strong desire to be a part of that group that is seen to be a constructive member of society, to be looked up to be admired. And I do wonder if maybe our field of psychology is vulnerable to the idea of wanting to be attached to status, wanting to be seen to be intelligent, scientific, on the side of the evidence and so on, which by themselves are perfectly good motives. Who wouldn't want to be intelligent? Who wouldn't want to be evidence-based and so on? But I think it's become more about the perception of being those things as opposed to the reality, because we know good science is about questioning. It's a skeptical process. It's not something where a piece of information is taken and then confirmation is searched for to support that idea. That's a bias. Confirmation bias. It's something that science should avoid. And good scientific experiments are constructed to eliminate those things. But I do think that perhaps our field is enamored with the idea of being perceived in a certain way. And certainly from a political perspective, that narrative of which side is the intelligent, the scientific, and the defensible one, and the caring one, is only the side that agrees with the government of the day. So that's a sort of idea that I've been, playing around with in my mind to explain why that might be. I'm interested in your thoughts.
I put a post up on some of my thoughts around this process. I think it was earlier today on LinkedIn. And one of the things that I highlighted was in a conversation that I had with Dr. Stephen Porges, who developed the polyvagal theory of what's stress response and how to manage the stress response based on different neurological paradigms that are at play when it comes to the human body and functioning. He and I had a discussion after we finished that interview, and he said one thing that he'd noticed when he would ask questions of trauma therapists on their experiences working with clients and their own personal experiences in what got them into therapy and that sort of stuff. He had a sample of about 1,000 plus therapists, and roughly around 50% of those therapists, those trauma therapists, have had a trauma history of some sort themselves. And as a matter of fact, they had over a dozen different ways of training to help people within those trauma processing modalities. And so they were very, very interested in helping people, and perhaps heal thyself. It was a very important process that they would go back to. And I wondered how many of us in the mental health field have had our own stresses and our own traumas and our own experiences that have colored the way that we've perceived this threat, this apparent threat. And then we've taken the side of fear over helping somebody and advocating for somebody. We've fallen into that trap as any human would. And the small amount of people who stood up and said, nah, this isn't okay, I wonder what their stories are. And I wonder how they generally overcome fear in their life on a day-to-day basis. I wonder how they tend to work with their own stress in the day-to-day, and whether they fall into the same patterns of their clients, and whether we just continue to just reverberate this. So it's brought up a lot of questions for me, and it's a really interesting one that I don't have the answers to, but I have more questions to try to get down to it. My own experience is, what I've noticed about myself is my stress response tends to err on the side of approach rather than withdraw. I approach a certain, I mean, just yesterday, in our estate where we live, I was preparing my matcha tea in the morning, mixing it around. The door was open. I was just going to go outside and sit down, read my book with my tea on the side, and enjoy the morning before we had a few guests coming over. And at that point in time, I heard a really huge crunching outside, and almost like a metal scratch. And then I kind of tiptoed, and I could see over my fence, and I saw that a car had flipped on its roof. A car had just had an accident, boom, and it was just upside down. And what I did, I'm like, holy crap! And I sprint outside, I jump the fence, and I can see that someone's still in the car, and they're trying to get out of the car. And so I'm running to the car to see if they need any help. And then another guy, big burly dude, massive tattoos all over himself. He runs out shirtless. He does, still with his no socks on or anything. I'm running out with my socks on, and him and I are the only people that are on the road trying to help this person. Everyone else is like coming out with their phones, filming everything that's going on. And my wife's with the kids trying to get the phone on the ambulance, and the rest of that. She was all good towards the end, and everything was settled up. But this is the way that my body tends to react to stress. I tend to say, okay, what can be done about this? What can we do about this particular situation? And I've had many of those situations in my life where I tend to be hyper focused on attacking something, on approaching the stress rather than running away from it, rather than freezing, rather than becoming so overwhelmed that I fold into myself. This fight, flight, freeze, fall, and fawn responses that we tend to fall into depending on the stress. And that's a hugely long-winded response to the question of what is it that I want to, how do I make sense of this sort of stuff? But I wonder how much of that temperamental, personality-driven, and past experience feeds into our discipline within mental health. And dare I say it, the cowardice that ensues. But then I don't want to belittle people because I don't know their stories, and that's the tricky thing. It's like, where do we move, and how do we understand? That's where it brings more questions than it does answers. I hope I've answered your question in that one.
Yeah, I think that I really like your point there about the temperamental kind of differences, and that approach versus avoidance goals. And I do think that you're right. Temperament certainly plays a role, and it does make me think as well about just the propensity for us to look to others for guidance or cues for how we should respond to a novel situation we haven't encountered before. And developmentally, very young children will look to their parents when they come into a new environment to pick up on cues from the parent about how they should respond. Maybe it's to the approach of someone they don't know, a stranger, and they look to mum to, for some idea of, is this person someone that we know? Is this person someone that we should be friendly to? And so on. Or maybe they fall over and hurt themselves. First thing they do is look to mum to see, am I actually really hurt? Should I be worried about this, or am I okay? And I think that to an extent, we never really grow out of that. And in this day of social media, people are more acutely aware than ever, I think, of what do other people think and how are they responding, and tend to adapt their approach based on those things. And so we do get a more dichotomous or people falling into certain group ideas or group think. And perhaps our field is guilty in some respects of doing that same thing, that bystander effect you described before, of seeing the accident happening, looking to everybody else for how to respond, and kind of waiting for someone else to take the lead.